Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a brotherhood of warrior monks forged in the fires of the Crusades. In less than 2 centuries, they rose from obscurity to become one of the most powerful and wealthy organizations in the medieval world, commanding armies, financing kings, and pioneering international banking. Their iconic white mantles emblazoned with a red cross were a symbol of piety, courage, and immense power. But just as swiftly as they rose, they were brutally annihilated, condemned as heretics, and erased from history. What secrets did they guard? Was their downfall a result of greed, political conspiracy, or a curse that haunts their legend to this day? Join us as we uncover the epic saga of the rise and fall of the Knights Templar. The late 11th century was a world convulsed by faith and ambition. In 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon at the Council of Clermont that would set the world ablaze. His call to arms, a plea to the Knights of Christendom to reclaim the Holy Land from Seljuk Turkish control, was answered with a thunderous cry of Deus vult, God wills it. This was the genesis of the First Crusade, an unprecedented military pilgrimage that saw nobles, knights, and commoners march thousands of miles to the east. They were driven by a potent mixture of piety, the promise of plenary indulgence for their sins, and the allure of land and fortune in a new world. After years of brutal warfare, unimaginable hardship, and staggering loss of life, the Crusaders achieved the impossible. In the summer of 1099, they breached the formidable walls of Jerusalem, capturing the Holy City in a storm of violence and religious fervor. With this victory, the Crusader states were born: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These fledgling kingdoms, known collectively as Outremer, the land beyond the sea, were precarious islands of Christian rule in a vast and hostile territory. The immediate challenge was not just defending their newly conquered lands, but also securing them for the thousands of unarmed pilgrims who now began to flood the region. The roads were treacherous, plagued by bandits and Saracen raiding parties who preyed on the vulnerable. The journey from the coastal port of Jaffa to the holy sites of Jerusalem was a perilous gauntlet where faith alone was no shield. The new rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem lacked the manpower and resources to effectively police these vital routes. It was in this crucible of faith, danger, and necessity that the seeds of a new kind of order were sown. An order that would merge the piety of the monk with the martial prowess of the knight, forged in the holy fire of the Crusades. Around the year 1119, nearly 2 decades after the conquest of Jerusalem, the problem of pilgrim security had reached a crisis point. The roads of the Holy Land remained fraught with peril, a constant testament to the fragile grip the Crusaders held. It was in this environment that a French knight from the Champagne region, Hugues de Payens, stepped forward with a radical proposal. Accompanied by his relative, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, and 7 other knights, he approached Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem. They proposed the formation of a monastic order dedicated solely to the protection of Christian pilgrims on their journey to the holy sites. Theirs was a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but with a crucial addition: a commitment to wield the sword in defense of the faithful. King Baldwin II recognizing the value of such a dedicated force, granted them a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount for their headquarters. This site was revered by Christians as the location of Solomon's Temple, a place of immense religious significance. From this location, they would derive their more famous name. But in these early days, they were known by a humbler title, the Paupères Commilitons Christi, or the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ. For the first 9 years of their existence, they were a small, obscure group. They numbered only 9 knights and relied entirely on donations for their sustenance and equipment, embodying their vow of poverty. Their original seal depicted 2 knights riding a single horse, a powerful symbol of their destitution and brotherhood. They patrolled the roads, fought off brigands, and escorted weary travelers, their reputation slowly growing through their quiet, determined service. They were warrior monks, a concept that initially met with skepticism from some corners of the church. But their tangible impact on the safety of the pilgrim routes could not be denied. These 9 men, with nothing but their faith and their swords, were laying the foundation for what would become the most powerful and influential military order in the history of Christendom. For nearly a decade, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ operated in relative obscurity, a noble but small-scale endeavor. However, their founder, Hugues de Payens, understood that for the order to survive and grow, it needed the ultimate seal of approval, official sanction from the papacy. In 1127, he traveled back to Europe with a delegation of his fellow knights, embarking on a mission to gain legitimacy and, crucially, recruits and resources. His timing was impeccable. The idea of a holy war was still a powerful force in European consciousness, and the concept of a dedicated military order to defend its gains was compelling. The turning point came in January 1129 at the Council of Troyes, a significant church council held in the heart of Hugues' home region of Champagne. Here, he presented his case before the assembled ecclesiastical magnates. His most powerful advocate was Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of his era. Bernard, a Cistercian abbot and later a saint, was captivated by the idea of the Templars. He saw them as a new kind of knighthood, one that could channel the martial aggression of the aristocracy towards a holy purpose. He championed their cause, arguing that they were not merely soldiers, but agents of God's will. Thanks to Bernard's powerful endorsement, the Council of Troyes formally recognized the order and tasked Bernard himself with composing a set of rules for their conduct. This document, known as the Latin Rule, would become the bedrock of the Templar order. With the Pope's blessing, their status was transformed overnight. They were no longer just the keepers of the roads. They were the sanctioned guardians of the faith, headquartered at the very site of Solomon's Temple. Donations began to pour in. Land, castles, money, and supplies from nobles across Europe eager to contribute to the holy cause. The Templars were now a legitimate, powerful, and rapidly growing institution, destined to become the elite shock troops of Christendom. The official sanction granted at the Council of Troyes required a formal constitution, a guide to govern every aspect of a Templar's life. This was the Latin Rule, a code of 72 clauses drafted by Bernard of Clairvaux. It was a masterpiece of spiritual and military regulation, meticulously designed to shape a new breed of man, the warrior monk. At its core were the traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. A Templar owned nothing personally, All his possessions, from his armor to his horse, belonged to the order. This vow of poverty was meant to guard against greed and ensure that the order's vast wealth was used for its holy mission, not personal enrichment. The vow of chastity was absolute, intended to keep the knights pure and focused, free from worldly distractions and familial obligations. Obedience to the master of the order was paramount, mirroring a soldier's obedience to his commander and a monk's to his abbot. The rule dictated a life of rigorous discipline. Knights were to eat their meals in silence, listening to scripture readings. Their diet was simple, but sufficient to maintain a warrior's strength. They were forbidden from engaging in frivolous activities like hunting, hawking, or playing games of chance. Their attire was prescribed: a simple white mantle, symbolizing purity, upon which Pope Eugenius III would later add the iconic Red Cross. This white mantle was reserved for the knight brethren, distinguishing them from the sergeants who wore black or brown. The rule also detailed their military obligations. It specified the equipment a knight must have: 3 horses, armor, lance, and sword, and outlined battlefield conduct. A Templar was forbidden from retreating, unless the odds were greater than 3 to 1, and even then, only with the commander's permission. The banner of the order, the black and white beauseant, was never to be abandoned. This strict code forged an unparalleled fighting force, disciplined, fearless, and utterly devoted. It was a life of prayer and battle, a monk's vow fused with a warrior's deadly duty. The only seal of approval Queen Ranavalona ever sought was not etched in wax and sent from Rome, but was whispered on the wind from the spirits of her ancestors. In the early years of her reign, the seeds of a foreign faith, planted by the London Missionary Society, had begun to sprout across the Highlands. These missionaries, with their schools, printing presses, and message of a single distant God, represented a worldview utterly alien to the sacred traditions that formed the bedrock of Marina society. For a time, Ranavalona tolerated their presence, a carryover from the policies of her late husband, Radama I. She observed their progress, watched as Malagasy converts learned to read and write, and noted the influence they were gaining. But her tolerance was a mask for deep suspicion. She saw not enlightenment, but a spiritual sickness, not education, but indoctrination. This new faith demanded allegiance to a foreign king in heaven, which to Ranavalona was a direct challenge to her own divine right to rule on earth. The final verdict on this European spiritual invasion was delivered in 1835. In a thunderous public address, Ranavalona I issued her decree. She declared that the Christian God was not the God of her ancestors, and his worship was therefore forbidden. The practice of baptism, the observance of the Sabbath, and all forms of Christian assembly were outlawed. This was her definitive rejection of any papal seal of approval. She was severing the spiritual umbilical cord that the missionaries had tried to attach to her kingdom, pulling it back from the orbit of European religious authority. Her approval came from the Sampi, the royal idols, and the venerated dead who had ruled before her. She was the high priestess of a sovereign Malagasy spirituality, and in her kingdom there was no room for a competing deity, especially one whose followers in Europe were carving up the world. For the burgeoning community of Malagasy Christians, the cross was a symbol of salvation. Under Ranavalona's reign, it became something else entirely, a blood-red marker of their martyrdom. The Queen's 1835 decree was not a mere prohibition. It was a declaration of war on a belief system she viewed as treasonous. The period that followed, known as Nai Tani Maizena, or the time when the land was dark, was one of unimaginable terror for the faithful. Ranavalona unleashed a systematic and brutal persecution, determined to excise the Christian cancer from her kingdom. The primary instrument of her inquisition was the dreaded Tangina ordeal. Accused Christians were forced to ingest a poison extracted from the Tangina nut. Survival was deemed proof of innocence, while death, which was the far more common outcome, confirmed guilt. But this was only one method. The Queen's cruelty was grimly creative. Christians were sold into slavery, their property confiscated. They were thrown into ravenous crocodile pits, burned alive at the stake, or boiled in giant cauldrons. One of the most infamous methods of execution involved hurling believers from the sheer cliffs of Antananarivo's Royal Hill, their bodies dashing against the rocks below, as a warning to all who would dare defy the Queen and her gods. The stories of the martyrs are both harrowing and inspiring. Rasalama, the first Christian martyr, walked to her execution, singing hymns before being speared to death. Others were crucified or stoned, their faith remaining unshaken even in the face of excruciating pain. For nearly 3 decades, the cross in Madagascar was not a symbol of gentle piety, but one soaked in the blood of its followers. It was a testament to a faith so profound that thousands chose a horrific death over renouncing it, transforming Ranavalona's campaign of terror into an enduring legacy of Malagasy defiance and belief. While Ranavalona I was closing her kingdom to foreign ideas, she was simultaneously building it into a self-sufficient fortress. To resist the inevitable encroachment of European powers, she knew Madagascar could not depend on them for anything, especially the tools of war. This required a logistical and industrial revolution, orchestrated by the Queen and powered by the sweat and blood of her people. At the heart of this colossal undertaking was the system of Fanampuana, a form of unpaid state labor. For months at a time, subjects were conscripted from their villages and put to work on the Queen's grand projects. While undeniably brutal and exploitative, this system allowed her to mobilize a workforce of tens of thousands, transforming the landscape of her kingdom without spending a single coin on wages. They built roads through impenetrable forests, erected formidable stone fortresses, and dug canals. The logistical genius of the era was Jean Laborde, a shipwrecked French adventurer whose technical skills caught the Queen's eye. Under her patronage, he established a massive industrial complex just outside the capital. It was a marvel of ingenuity. Workers, under Laborde's direction, learned to manufacture everything the kingdom needed. They forged cannons, muskets, and swords of high quality. They produced gunpowder, built brick-making facilities, and even reverse-engineered lightning rods. They wove textiles and created fine soaps and porcelain. This industrial heartland was the engine of Ranavalona's isolationist policy. It supplied her enormous standing army, which numbered over 30,000 soldiers, making it one of the largest in Africa. Supplying this force with weapons, ammunition, and provisions was a monumental task, yet Ranavalona's centralized command structure made it possible. She was not just a queen. She was the ultimate quartermaster, a master of logistics and supply, who turned her island nation into a bastion of indigenous industry and military might. In Europe, banking dynasties were built on credit, debt, and complex financial instruments. In Ranavalona's Madagascar, the entire economy was a closed loop, and she was the sole, undisputed banker. She did not deal in ledgers and loans. She dealt in absolute control over every resource within her domain. Her financial system was a direct reflection of her political philosophy. All wealth flowed from the land and the people, and all of it belonged, ultimately, to the sovereign. The Queen established a rigid state monopoly on all foreign trade. No merchant could buy or sell goods without the Crown's permission and its significant cut. Valuable exports like cattle, rice, and timber were funneled through royal agents, ensuring the treasury, not private entrepreneurs, reaped the profits. This immense income was used to finance her industrial projects, and most importantly, her military. It paid for the muskets forged in Laborde's factories and the salaries of the officers who commanded her vast army. This was not a market economy. It was a command economy where the palace was the central bank, the treasury, and the Federal Reserve all rolled into one. Wealth was also measured in people. Through the Phantom Puana system, she could command millions of hours of labor, a resource more valuable than gold. This human capital was her primary asset, which she spent on infrastructure and defense. Taxes were collected not just in currency, but in kind, a portion of a farmer's rice harvest, a weaver's cloth, a blacksmith's tools. By centralizing all economic power, Ranavalona effectively firewalled her kingdom from the predatory financial systems of Europe. She rejected foreign debt, refused trade agreements that did not serve her interests, and ensured that the wealth of Madagascar was used to protect the sovereignty of Madagascar. In her world, she was the only banker that mattered. In the arid, contested lands of the Levant, the Crusader states were islands in a hostile sea. To survive, to project power beyond the walls of their few coastal cities, they required a revolutionary solution. They found it in stone. This was the age of the castle builders, an era where faith and military engineering merged to create some of the most formidable fortifications the world had ever seen. These were not merely castles. They were the fortresses of God, physical manifestations of the Crusader will to remain, to dominate, and to defend their fragile kingdom. From the commanding heights of Crac de Chevalier, garrisoned by the Knights Hospitaliers, to the strategic bulwark of Belvoir overlooking the Jordan Valley, these structures were masterpieces of design. The architects learned from their Byzantine and Muslim adversaries, then innovated, creating concentric rings of defense, deadly killing grounds between inner and outer walls, and projecting towers that allowed for flanking fire against any attacker. Each stone was a statement of permanence. The sheer scale of these projects was staggering, requiring immense wealth and manpower drawn from across Christendom. They served as administrative centers, secure depots for supplies, and bases for launching raids deep into enemy territory. For a knight looking out from the battlements of Carac Castle, the vast desert below was not just a landscape. It was a frontier to be controlled. These fortresses allowed a small number of defenders to hold off vastly superior forces, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. They were the anchors of the kingdom, the symbols of an unyielding presence. But they also fostered a dangerous mindset, a fortress mentality. While they provided security, they also isolated the Frankish lords from the local populace, reinforcing their status as a foreign ruling class. The immense cost of their upkeep drained the kingdom's resources. Tying military strength to static defense rather than mobile field armies. For now, however, these stone giants stood as silent, imposing sentinels, a testament to the ambition and desperation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. By the autumn of 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced its gravest crisis yet. The great Sultan Saladin, having consolidated his power in Egypt and Syria, marched into Outremer with an overwhelming force of over 20,000 seasoned warriors. The kingdom was stripped bare of defenders. Its main army was campaigning in the north. All that stood between Saladin and Jerusalem was a token force, led by a boy king seemingly cursed by God. 16-year-old Baldwin IV was afflicted with leprosy, his body failing, his hands wrapped in bandages. Yet within that decaying frame burned an indomitable spirit. Against the advice of his counselors, Baldwin refused to cower behind Jerusalem's walls. He ordered the sacred relic of the true cross to be brought forth and rode out to meet the invading horde with barely 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. Saladin, contemptuous of this meager force, grew careless. He allowed his massive army to spread out, pillaging the countryside as he advanced toward the holy city, believing the battle already won. On November 25th, near the hill of Montgisard, Baldwin saw his chance. Concealed by the terrain, he rallied his men. With the true cross held aloft, he knelt in the sand and prayed for victory. Then he gave the order to charge. What followed was one of the most astonishing feats in military history. The small Crusader force, led by their fearless Leper King, smashed into the flank of Saladin's disorganized army like a thunderbolt. The ferocity and surprise of the charge shattered the Saracen lines. The Templars, under Odo of Saint Amand, fought with a suicidal fury that bordered on the divine. Saladin's personal Mamluk bodyguard was annihilated. The Sultan himself was nearly captured, forced to flee for his life on a racing camel. The great invading army dissolved into a panicked rout, harried for miles by the victorious Christians. The victory at Montgisard was miraculous, a stunning testament to Baldwin IV's courage and tactical genius. It secured the kingdom for another decade, but it was a victory bought with the last of its strength, a brilliant sunset before the inevitable night. A decade after the miracle of Montgisard, the sun set on the kingdom of Jerusalem. The brilliant Leper King, Baldwin IV, was dead. In his place sat Guy of Lusignan, a weak and indecisive ruler manipulated by the reckless and arrogant Renaud of Châtillon. Renaud's repeated provocative attacks on Muslim caravans shattered the fragile truce with Saladin, giving the Sultan the perfect pretext to unite the Islamic world for a holy war. In the summer of 1187, Saladin invaded, laying siege to the city of Tiberias, a deliberate trap. The Crusader leadership convened a council of war. The wise Count Raymond of Tripoli urged caution, advising they remain near the springs of La Safarie and force Saladin to come to them. But Renaud and the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, goaded King Guy, branding caution as cowardice. In a fateful decision that sealed the kingdom's doom, Guy ordered the entire army, the largest the kingdom had ever assembled, to march across the parched, waterless plains to relieve Tiberias. The march, under the searing July sun, was hell on earth. The heavily armored knights and foot soldiers were relentlessly harassed by Saracen horse archers, who set fire to the dry brush, choking the Crusaders with smoke. Thirst became a weapon more potent than any sword. By the time the exhausted, dehydrated army reached the hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee, they were surrounded. They camped on a dry plateau between two peaks known as the Horns of Hattin. There was no escape. On the morning of July 4th, Saladin attacked. The battle was not a contest of arms, but a slaughter. The Christian infantry, desperate for water, broke ranks and fled towards the distant sea, only to be cut down. The knights, fighting on foot around the king's red tent, made a series of heroic but futile last stands. By the end of the day, the entire army was killed or captured. The sacred relic of the true cross was lost. The flower of Crusader nobility was gone. Hattin was more than a defeat. It was an annihilation from which the First Kingdom of Jerusalem would never recover. With the Crusader army destroyed at Hattin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lay naked and defenseless. Saladin did not hesitate. His forces swept through the land like a storm, and the great fortresses and cities, their garrisons slain on that dusty battlefield, fell one after another. Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, all capitulated. Only a few coastal strongholds, like Tyre, held out. Soon the Sultan's gaze fell upon the ultimate prize, the very heart of the conflict, the holy city of Jerusalem. The city was overflowing with terrified refugees and had few defenders. Its defense fell to Balian of Ibelin, one of the few high-ranking nobles to have escaped Hattin. He organized a desperate defense, knighting every boy of noble birth and arming the citizenry. For days, they repelled Saladin's assaults. The Sultan's miners eventually brought down a section of the city wall, and the situation became hopeless. Balian went to negotiate with Saladin, threatening to destroy the city and its holy sites, including the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, rather than see its people massacred. Saladin, a man of chivalry and pragmatism, agreed to terms. There would be no repeat of the bloodbath that had accompanied the First Crusade's capture of the city in 1099. Instead, the inhabitants would be allowed to ransom themselves. On October 2nd, 1187, after 88 years of Christian rule, Balian of Ibelin handed the keys of Jerusalem to Saladin. The Great Golden Cross was taken down from the Dome of the Rock and dragged through the streets, while Muslim banners were raised over the walls. For the Christian world, the news was a cataclysmic shock, a sign of God's profound displeasure. The fall of Jerusalem ended an era. The dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was shattered, its purpose lost. The loss of the city would not be the end of the story, but the beginning of a new, desperate chapter. The Third Crusade. With the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, the very heart of the Crusader mission was ripped out, and the Knights Templar, protectors of the Holy City, were forced into a strategic retreat. Their new nerve center became the formidable port city of Acre, a bustling, cosmopolitan bastion on the Levantine coast. This was no mere outpost. It was a kingdom by the sea, and the Templar commandery was its fortress palace. The structure was immense, a testament to the order's wealth and engineering prowess. It dominated the city's skyline with two massive towers, walls of staggering thickness, and a network of subterranean tunnels that connected it to the port and other key fortifications. Within these walls, the Grand Master presided over an international corporation of faith and finance. Acre became the headquarters for an empire that stretched from London to the Levant. From here, the Templars managed their vast agricultural estates across Europe, oversaw their pioneering banking system that made pilgrimages safer, and commanded a formidable military machine. The commandery was more than a barracks. It was the treasury, the administrative hub, and the supreme court of the order. The city itself was a melting pot of cultures, a vibrant, chaotic mix of Italian merchants, French knights, Byzantine diplomats, and local artisans. Yet, beneath the surface of this thriving commercial hub, a palpable tension lingered. The Templars, along with the Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights, were the city's primary defenders, locked in a precarious stalemate with the surrounding Mamluk Sultanate. Every ship that arrived brought new pilgrims and goods, but it also brought news of the shifting political sands in Europe and the ever-present threat from the east. For a time, Acre was the defiant symbol of Christian presence in the Holy Land, and the Templar commandery was its unyielding heart. It was a golden age of power and influence, but it was an era lived on the edge of a precipice, a final, glorious stand before the tide of history would turn against them forever. While the Templars were founded as land-based warriors, their relocation to coastal strongholds like Acre necessitated a profound transformation. They became masters of the sea. The Templar fleet evolved from a logistical necessity, ferrying pilgrims and supplies, into one of the most powerful and sophisticated naval forces in the Mediterranean. This was not a national navy, loyal to a king, but a private, multinational fleet, loyal only to the order itself. Their ships, including large transport dromons and swift war galleys, were built in their own shipyards in southern Europe and the Levant. They controlled key ports and islands, creating a maritime network that ensured their dominance over critical trade routes. The iconic Red Cross on a white sail became a symbol of safe passage for Christian merchants and a dire warning to pirates and rivals. The Templar fleet did more than just transport men and material. It was a crucial component of their economic empire. They ran a highly profitable shipping business, leasing vessels to merchants and offering armed convoy protection for valuable cargo, effectively acting as an international maritime security force. This naval supremacy allowed them to move wealth, gold, silver, and crucial documents between their commanderies with unparalleled security, reinforcing their role as the bankers of Christendom. They could enforce blockades, project power, and respond rapidly to threats anywhere in the Mediterranean basin. This maritime strength made them indispensable to European monarchs and the papacy, but it also fostered jealousy and suspicion. The Templars were, in effect, a state without a sovereign territory, possessing their own army, their own treasury, and their own navy. They answered to no king, only to the Pope. As they sailed the Mediterranean with impunity, their white sails catching the wind, they were a symbol of incredible power, but also of an independence that many, particularly the indebted King of France, were beginning to see as a direct threat to their own authority. Across the sea in Paris, a different kind of power was being consolidated. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his handsome, emotionless demeanor, was a monarch of immense ambition and chilling pragmatism. His goal was absolute: to create a centralized, all-powerful French state, free from the overreaching influence of feudal lords and the papacy. But this grand vision came at an astronomical cost. Philip's incessant wars against England and in Flanders, coupled with his expansive bureaucracy, had pushed the royal treasury to the brink of collapse. The French crown was drowning in a sea of debt, and Philip was a king who would stop at nothing to secure his finances. He had already resorted to a series of ruthless measures. He repeatedly debased the kingdom's coinage, causing widespread inflation and economic chaos. but providing short-term infusions of cash. In 1306, he orchestrated the sudden expulsion of all Jews from France, seizing their property and the debts owed to them. He had done the same to the Lombard bankers. These actions provided temporary relief, but failed to solve the fundamental problem. And all the while, one organization stood as a stark reminder of his own poverty: the Knights Templar. The Paris Temple was the center of the order's financial operations and effectively served as the French royal treasury. Philip himself banked with the Templars. He knew firsthand the staggering extent of their wealth. He saw their vast landholdings across his kingdom, their immunity from his taxes, and their international network that operated beyond his control. To a king obsessed with absolute authority and desperate for gold, the Templars were no longer a pious military order. They were a state within his state, a foreign power on French soil, and most importantly, a colossal, untapped source of revenue. The order's wealth, once its greatest strength, had now become its greatest vulnerability. In the cold, calculating mind of Philip the Fair, a plan began to form. A plan that would solve his financial woes and eliminate a powerful rival in a single, devastating blow. The plot against the Templars was not a spontaneous act of royal greed, but a meticulously planned conspiracy, executed with the precision of a military campaign. At the heart of this dark enterprise was King Philip and his chief minister, the formidable and utterly ruthless lawyer, Guillaume de Nogaret. Nogaret had already proven his loyalty by orchestrating the kidnapping of Pope Boniface VIII. Dismantling a military order was well within his capabilities. For months, they worked in the deepest secrecy, understanding that the Templars were too powerful to be challenged openly. Their strategy was not one of conquest, but of character assassination on an epic scale. They needed a justification so shocking that it would paralyze the order and turn public opinion, and even the Pope, against them. Ex-Templars, often expelled from the order for misconduct, were found and coerced into providing damning confessions. From these testimonies, Nogaret and Philip's inquisitors crafted a list of charges designed to inspire maximum horror: heresy, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, institutionalized sodomy, and worshipping a demonic idol known as Baphomet. The accusations were a masterstroke of black propaganda. With the narrative prepared, the operational phase began. Sealed orders were dispatched to royal seneschals in every corner of France. These letters contained precise, chilling instructions to be opened simultaneously across the kingdom on the evening of Thursday, October 12, 1307. The orders called for the immediate arrest of every Templar in France at dawn the following day, Friday the 13th. The element of surprise was total. The Templars, many of whom were elderly administrators and farmers rather than elite warriors, were caught completely off guard. In a single, coordinated swoop, Grand Master Jacques de Molay and thousands of his knights were dragged from their beds, clapped in irons, and thrown into royal dungeons. The conspiracy was a stunning success. Philip had decapitated the order, seized its assets, and launched a propaganda war he was destined to win. The age of the Knights Templar was about to end, not on a battlefield in the Holy Land, but in the torture chambers of a pious, bankrupt king. The air in France on the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, was crisp with the chill of autumn, but a deeper, more sinister cold was about to descend upon the kingdom. Before the sun had fully risen, A meticulously coordinated operation, years in the making, was set into motion. Acting on sealed orders from King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, royal seneschals and bailiffs across the nation unlatched their secret directives. The target was not a foreign enemy or a band of common criminals, but one of the most powerful, wealthy, and respected institutions in Christendom, the Knights Templar. The element of surprise was absolute. For 2 centuries, the Templars had been the bankers of Europe, the elite fighting force of the Crusades, and landowners of immense influence, accountable only to the Pope. They were considered untouchable. Yet, on this single infamous morning, that perception was shattered forever. In Paris, the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, an aging veteran of the Holy Wars, was arrested at the Paris Temple, the Order's headquarters. He and dozens of his knights were taken completely unawares, offering no resistance as they were led away in chains. Similar scenes unfolded simultaneously in Templar preceptories from Normandy to Provence. The king's men moved with ruthless efficiency, seizing not only the knights, but also the Order's vast records, and most importantly, the keys to its legendary treasury. The official charges, when they were finally read, were as shocking as the arrests themselves: heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, and obscene rituals. To the common person, these accusations against the warrior monks were unthinkable. Philip IV had orchestrated a masterful coup, a strike against an internal power he viewed as a threat to his own absolute authority, a state within his state. The date, Friday the 13th, would forever be seared into the Western psyche as a symbol of misfortune and doom. Its dark legacy born from the ashes of the Knights Templar. Following the mass arrests, the Knights Templar were cast into the dungeons of the French monarchy, their fate now in the hands of King Philip's agents and the Dominican inquisitors. The trials that ensued were a grotesque theater of cruelty, designed not to uncover truth, but to manufacture guilt. The list of accusations was a litany of blasphemy, crafted to incite public horror and justify the king's actions. The knights were accused of denying Christ and spitting upon the crucifix during their secret initiation ceremonies. They were charged with worshiping a pagan idol, a mysterious bearded head referred to as Baphomet. Furthermore, the indictment included lurid claims of institutionalized homosexuality and financial corruption. To extract the necessary confessions, the inquisitors employed methods of torture refined to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim alive. Knights were subjected to the strappado, where their arms were tied behind their backs and they were hoisted into the air by their wrists, dislocating their shoulders. Their feet were greased with fat and held over fire, burning the flesh and bone. The rack was used to stretch their bodies to the breaking point. Under such relentless agony, the will of even the most hardened warrior crumbled. Men confessed to anything and everything their tormentors demanded. They admitted to spitting on the cross, to worshiping the idol, to every profane act imagined by their accusers. These coerced confessions became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, presented as irrefutable proof of the order's systemic corruption. However, a glimmer of defiance remained. When dozens of knights were brought before papal commissioners, away from the immediate threat of the king's torturers, many bravely recanted their confessions, proclaiming their innocence and the order's piety. But this act of courage sealed their doom. By recanting a confession made to the Inquisition, they were deemed relapsed heretics, a crime punishable by death. The trials became a self-fulfilling prophecy of guilt, a brutal machine where innocence was not an option. 7 long years of imprisonment, torture, and legal maneuvering had passed since that fateful Friday in 1307. On March 18th, 1314, the final act of the Templar tragedy unfolded on a small island in the River Seine, the Île aux Juifs, in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral. A great crowd gathered to witness the fate of the order's highest leaders, Grand Master Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy. Both were old men, their bodies broken by years of harsh confinement. But their spirits remained unbroken. They had previously confessed under duress to the charges laid against them, and in exchange for their cooperation, they were to be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. As the verdict was read aloud, a stunning act of defiance occurred. Jacques de Molay, his voice ringing out across the assembled crowd, retracted his confession. He declared that he was not a heretic, that the order was holy and just, and that his only crime was to have betrayed it by lying to save his own life. Geoffrey de Charnay immediately followed his Grand Master's lead, echoing his proclamation of innocence. King Philip IV, who was present, was enraged by this public reversal. There was to be no leniency for relapsed heretics. He ordered that they be burned at the stake immediately, that very evening. As the flames licked at the pyre, legend holds that Jacques de Molay issued a final, terrifying prophecy. With his last breath, he summoned his persecutors to meet him before the judgment of God. He cursed Pope Clement V, declaring he would meet his end within 40 days, and King Philip IV, who would follow him within the year. Whether a curse or a remarkable coincidence, history records a chilling epilogue. Pope Clement V died just over a month later from a sudden, agonizing illness. King Philip the Fair, the Iron Monarch of France, suffered a stroke while on a hunting trip and died in November of that same year. The Grand Master's curse became an indelible part of the Templar legend, a final ghostly vengeance from beyond the grave. With the Grand Master's execution, the Knights Templar, as an official entity, ceased to exist. 2 years prior, in 1312, Pope Clement V, under immense pressure from King Philip, had formally dissolved the order with the papal bull Vox in Excelso. It was a political dissolution, not a condemnation, a subtle distinction that acknowledged the lack of concrete evidence from the trials outside of France. The order's immense wealth and property, the true motive for its destruction, were ordered to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. However, Philip IV and other monarchs ensured that vast sums were diverted into their own coffers to cover the supposed costs of the trials. While the order was officially disbanded, its legacy was only just beginning. In some parts of Europe, where the king's influence did not reach, the Templars were treated more leniently. In Portugal, King Denis I negotiated with the Pope to transfer Templar assets and personnel to a new order, the Order of Christ, which would play a pivotal role in Portugal's Age of Discovery. But in the popular imagination, the Templars transformed from a historical institution into a vessel for myth and mystery. Their brutal suppression gave rise to enduring conspiracy theories. Did they escape with their fabled treasure? Were they the secret guardians of holy relics, like the Shroud of Turin or the Holy Grail? These questions fueled centuries of speculation, linking the Templars to everything from Freemasonry to secret societies that control the world. They became symbols of martyrdom, victims of a greedy king and a weak pope. Their story serves as a timeless cautionary tale about the clash between temporal and spiritual power, and how quickly an institution can be destroyed by accusations, propaganda, and greed. The warrior monks were gone, but their echo in eternity, a blend of history, legend, and conspiracy, continues to captivate and fascinate the world to this day.